Hello, and welcome back. Whether you're here for the first time or you've been with us before, I'm so glad you're here. My name is Mr. Dantello, and this is your space to wind down for the night with stories that linger in the quiet hours. Tonight, we're exploring something that feels particularly unsettling: the psychological and mind-bending. These are stories where the real horror lives in uncertainty, in the creeping feeling that something isn't quite right with the way we understand our own lives. Reality gets a little softer around the edges. We have 3 stories for you tonight. First, we'll hear about someone whose commute started taking them to places they don't recognize. A journey that stops making sense. Then there's the strange matter of an apartment next door that's always belonged to someone, even though they're not sure when it became theirs. And finally, we'll explore the unsettling question of whether someone ever actually left the office yesterday, and what that might mean. If you're finding these stories helpful for sleep or just a moment of peace, please do like and subscribe. It means everything to this channel. Now, get yourself comfortable. Find whatever position feels right. Dim the lights if you haven't already, and let everything else fade away for a while. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Now, let's begin with our first story. Story 1. My commute started taking me to places I don't recognize. The same song was playing on the radio when I pulled out of the driveway, not because I'd restarted the playlist, but because I always caught it at this exact moment. 6:47 a.m. The same moment every morning for 3 years. My coffee was still hot in the cup holder. Steam rising in that particular way it does when the morning is cool but not cold. 43 degrees, according to the car's readout. November had that quality to it, where the air felt thin and washed clean, like it had been rinsed overnight and hung out to dry. I'd learned to know the weather by the way the light fell through the windshield, by the feeling in my hands on the wheel. The commute was 23 minutes, 13 traffic lights if they were all red, which they never were. 5th and Main had a green arrow at 6:52. The coffee shop on Ashford came up at mile 6.2 right after the overpass, where the asphalt had a distinctive dark patch that I'd watched weather and crack over the years. Everything was arithmetic. Everything was known. My name is Taylor. I sold commercial insurance. I was good at it, which meant I was invisible at it. The kind of person who handled other people's problems so smoothly they forgot you were there. My colleagues knew my coffee order. They knew I took Tuesdays off for the dentist. They knew I existed because I arrived at the same time, did the same work, and left at the same time. Being predictable was a form of safety. The house was behind me now, shrinking in the mirror. It was a small house with white siding and black shutters. The kind of house you could describe to someone and they would nod without really picturing it. My mortgage was reasonable. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that meant nothing bad happened there, just nothing at all. I'd chosen it specifically for its ordinariness. I turned onto Mercer Street, which fed into the main route. The trees along Mercer were losing their leaves at the moment I drove past them. I noticed things like that, the details that marked the passage of time. A leaf would be hanging on a branch on Monday, gone by Thursday. It was comforting, this slow documentation of seasonal change. It meant time was moving normally. The first traffic light on the route was at the corner of Mercer and 4th Avenue. It was red. I slowed smoothly, coming to a stop exactly where the crosswalk began. The road here was wide, 4 lanes, and I could always see the next traffic light in the distance, already green, already promising. I tapped the steering wheel while I waited. The song on the radio was nearly over. To my left, a pedestrian was walking along the sidewalk, moving at the pace of someone with nowhere urgent to be. They wore a gray jacket. I wouldn't have noticed them particularly except that I saw someone in a gray jacket nearly every morning at this intersection. Not the same person necessarily, but the same idea of a person. The same color, the same speed. Or maybe it was the same person. I'd never really looked at their face. The light turned green, and I moved forward, accelerating gently. The road was familiar in the way a hallway is familiar when you've walked it 1,000 times. Not the kind of familiar where you could draw it with your eyes closed, but the kind where your hands know exactly how much to turn the wheel, where your foot knows precisely how hard to press. My body had memorized this route. My mind could be elsewhere. Which is why it took me almost a full block to realize that the street felt narrower. Not dramatically narrower. It wasn't the kind of thing that would have alarmed me if I'd been paying attention. But I wasn't paying attention. I was thinking about the email I'd need to send when I got to the office, about the client who was unhappy with their quote. The street simply registered, in some part of my brain that wasn't fully conscious, as different. Smaller, I glanced to either side. The sidewalks seemed closer to the road than they had before. The buildings on the right side, a dentist's office, a tax preparation service, a closed storefront that had been closed since I'd started taking this route, seemed to lean slightly forward as if they were interested in what happened in the street. But when I looked ahead, the road opened back out again. The narrowness was past me, already part of the distance I'd traveled. I didn't think about it. There was no reason to think about it. The next intersection was 5th and Main. This was where the green arrow appeared at exactly 6:52. And I always reached it at 6:52 because I had done this calculation so many times that my driving speed had adjusted itself to synchronize with the lights. It was one of the small satisfactions of the route, not hitting a red light at 5th and Main, one less delay, one less moment of standing still. Except the traffic light was different, not gone. I want to be precise about what happened because precision matters here. The traffic light wasn't absent, but it was wrong. It was a different style, newer with different configuration. The one I was used to had 3 lights arranged in a standard vertical pattern. This one had 4 lights, and they were arranged differently, with the arrow on the side instead of integrated. And there was a sign beneath it now, a turn-only sign. This intersection had become a turn-only intersection. I had to turn left. I don't remember deciding to turn. My hands simply moved the wheel. My car made the turn as if this was the correct route, as if I'd always turned here, as if this was part of the 23-minute commute that my body and my car had memorized together. But it wasn't. I was suddenly on a street I didn't recognize, though everything about it was familiar in a vague, generic way. Brick buildings and parked cars and the kind of morning light that was becoming less rare as winter approached. The coffee shop on Ashford would have been coming up. I was thinking about the coffee shop, about the particular way the barista made the foam on the lattes, about the small basket of free pastries they put out on Thursdays. I was thinking about how many times I'd driven past that coffee shop without ever going inside. 3 years. 3 years of the same route, and I'd never gone inside once. This struck me suddenly as odd, a small failure of curiosity. I turned the corner onto what should have been Ashford. It wasn't Ashford. Or maybe it was, technically. Maybe I was just disoriented about which direction I was facing. But the coffee shop wasn't there. In its place was a storefront, and the storefront was empty. Not recently emptied, not the kind of empty that suggested a business had folded, the kind of empty that suggested nothing had ever been there at all. The windows were the flat gray of weathered glass, not dirty so much as simply absent of reflection. There were no remnants of the previous business, no ghost letters on the brick where a sign had hung, no scuffs on the doorframe where merchandise had been displayed. The brick was uniform. It was as if that building had never housed anything at all. I was past it before I fully processed what I'd seen. My hands had continued driving without permission from my brain. The car was moving at exactly the speed it needed to in order to maintain the schedule, even though I'd turned at the wrong place, even though the route had changed. Mile 6.4. That was where the coffee shop had been. At mile 6.2, immediately after the overpass. Or was it 6.4? The mileage counter on my dashboard suddenly felt unreliable. The time was 6:51. I'd lost a minute. It wasn't possible to lose a minute if the route had only changed at one intersection. But I'd lost it somehow. The math didn't match. The calendar in my mind, the one that had tracked every morning of the past 3 years, the one that knew exactly how long everything took, suddenly had a gap in it. I focused on the road ahead. The road was normal, perfectly normal. I passed a fire station that I recognized. I passed the corner store where they sold coffee to go, a cheaper option that I'd never used because I had the ritual of the drive, the heating of the beverage timed to the arrival at the office. Everything was coming back into alignment. The world was settling back into the pattern I understood. The next light was on Fifth Avenue. I knew this intersection. I recognized the bank on the corner, the parking garage across the street. This was correct. This was where the route should be. I was back on schedule. The light was red. I slowed and stopped. A gray jacket was walking across the crosswalk in front of me. It was the same pedestrian from before, or one identical to them. Same jacket, same pace, same strange anonymity. Except I was at least 2 miles from where I'd seen them. I'd taken a wrong turn. I'd driven in a direction that shouldn't have brought me to this intersection. And yet, here they were. The pedestrian didn't look at my car as they crossed. They simply moved through the space indifferent to its existence. When they reached the other side of the street, they turned the corner and disappeared from view. The light turned green. I turned the corner in the same direction the pedestrian had gone, following the correct route back to the main avenue. Everything was back on track. The road felt normal again. The buildings were the right size. The morning was continuing. But something had shifted. Some small gear inside the machinery of my routine had clicked slightly out of alignment. I could feel it. I could feel the world being approximately correct rather than exactly correct, and I had no idea how to put it back. The clock on my dashboard said 6:54. I should have been at my office by now. The drive, even taking the detour, should have put me there by 7:10. That was fine. That was still acceptable. That still left me with enough time to prepare for the day before the office officially opened at 8 Lepo. But somewhere between the wrong turn and the pedestrian in gray, I had a sense, not quite a fear, but a recognition of something slightly wrong with the world. That I wasn't going to arrive at the office at all in the next 16 minutes. And I was right. The office building appeared where it always appeared, at the corner of Fifth and Mercer. I'd driven past it hundreds of times. I knew the exact spot where the parking structure entrance would be, the way the revolving doors caught the morning light, the particular shade of the building's facade. It was as familiar as my own reflection, except the building wasn't there. I mean, something was there. There was a structure occupying that space. But it was wrong. The proportions were subtly off. The windows didn't align the way I remembered. The entrance seemed to have been relocated slightly to the left or possibly to the right. The color was almost correct, but not quite. Like someone had looked at a photograph of my office building and tried to recreate it from memory, getting 95% of the way there before giving up. I pulled into the parking structure without thinking about it. The decision wasn't conscious. My hand simply turned the wheel. My foot found the brake as the ramp descended into the cool, dim underground. I'd done this 1,000 times. My body knew the route even when my mind wasn't paying attention. The parking level was empty except for a blue sedan parked 3 spaces down from my usual spot. I didn't recognize it. On most mornings, there were 17 or 18 cars already parked here by the time I arrived. It was 6:58 a.m. The lot shouldn't be this empty. I parked in my space 247, and sat for a moment with the engine running. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical song. Water dripped somewhere deeper in the structure, a sound I'd never heard before or had never noticed before. The two seemed equivalent. A pigeon moved across the concrete somewhere above, its claws clicking against the concrete with an intensity that seemed wrong, too loud, too present. I turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and complete. No traffic sounds from the street above, no movement from inside the building. Even the water had stopped dripping, or perhaps had never been dripping at all. The parking structure existed in a pocket of absolute quiet. I got out of the car. The concrete was cold under my shoes. I could hear my own footsteps, which was normal, but they sounded different, flatter, more definite, as if the space was smaller than it should be, closer, like the parking structure had condensed around me without moving its walls. The elevator doors were where they were always located, at the far end of the level. I walked toward them, my keys in my hand. I always held my keys in my hand. It made me feel safer, though I'd never articulated why. The elevator arrived immediately, as though it had been waiting. Inside, the walls were mirrored on 3 sides, a detail I should have remembered, but didn't. In the reflection, I could see myself standing in the center of the elevator car, the blue shirt I'd put on this morning, the gray trousers, the dark shoes, the keys glinting in my fingers. I looked approximately normal, like a person who was going to work on an ordinary morning. I pressed the button for the 17th floor. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the doors hissed closed with a sound like something breathing out, and the elevator began to rise. The motion was smooth, but I had the sensation that I was moving in a direction that wasn't quite vertical, as though the elevator shaft had been subtly tilted, and I was ascending at an angle I couldn't quite perceive. My inner ear objected to this. My stomach performed a small, uncertainly movement. The numbers above the door lit up in sequence. 2, 3, 4, 5. At the 8th floor, the elevator stopped and the doors opened. No one was waiting. There was no hallway beyond the doors, only a white wall at a distance of perhaps 2 feet from the elevator car. The wall was blank and unmarked. The doors remained open, the white wall waiting. I didn't press the button again. I simply stood there, watching the white space, waiting to see if something would happen. Some part of me understood that this was wrong, that there should be a hallway, a corridor leading to offices and conference rooms, and the break room where people left handwritten notes on the refrigerator about whose turn it was to buy coffee. But another part of me, a larger part, simply waited with a kind of blank patience, as though the white wall was a natural thing, a correct thing. And my job was simply to accept it. The doors closed. The elevator resumed its ascent. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. The numbers climbed. The mirrored walls reflected my image from every angle. In the left mirror, I could see the back of my head. In the right mirror, I could see my profile. In the central mirror directly ahead, I could see my face. Watching myself with the vague interest of someone observing a stranger on public transportation. The elevator reached the 17th floor. The doors opened, and I saw the hallway. It was correct. It was exactly as it should be. The gray carpet, the white walls, the series of doors leading to individual offices, the emergency exit sign glowing green in the distance. Everything was in its proper place. I stepped out of the elevator, and the doors closed behind me. The hallway stretched forward and backward in both directions, which was impossible. The 17th floor wasn't built that way. There should be a dead end to the left where the building's external wall began. But instead, the corridor continued, stretching into a distance that seemed to increase even as I looked at it. I started walking toward my office. The door was marked with my name, or rather, it was marked with a name that I understood to be my name, though I couldn't quite read the letters themselves. They wavered slightly, as though written in water. I reached for the handle. My office was empty except for a desk, a chair, and a computer. On the computer screen, a cursor blinked slowly. The blinking was rhythmic and hypnotic. Blink, space, blink, space, blink. It seemed to correspond with my own heartbeat, or perhaps my heartbeat was corresponding to it. It was difficult to determine which was driving which. I sat at the desk. I reached for the mouse. The computer came to life without my touching it. The screen filled with text, an email, or a document, or something that resembled both and neither. The words were in a language I should have understood, but didn't. They were English letters arranged in English syntax, but the meaning of them slipped away from my comprehension like water through open fingers. The more I tried to focus on them, the less sense they made. I looked at the clock in the bottom right corner of the screen, 7:31 a.m. I looked at the clock on my wrist, 7:31 a.m. I looked out the window of my office. The city wasn't there. Instead, I was looking at a gray wall at a distance of approximately 10 feet from the glass. It was the same white-gray as the surface inside the elevator, and it seemed to be waiting for something, or for someone, or simply waiting in the way that blank surfaces wait. I put my head in my hands. The morning continued. I could hear the sound of other people in the hallway now, footsteps, voices, the muted sound of doors opening and closing, the sounds of the office coming to life on a normal day. I recognized the rhythm of it. This was what 8 a.m. sounded like. This was how the day was supposed to begin. But I remained at my desk, looking at the words that wouldn't parse into meaning, listening to the familiar sounds of a place that no longer seemed to exist in any direction from where I was sitting. My hands were still holding my keys. I'd never put them down. Their weight in my palm felt like something I was supposed to understand as important, but the significance of it remained just beyond my reach. Like a word on the tip of your tongue that you can taste but never quite speak aloud. I stood up from my desk. The chair rolled backward silently, stopping at a distance that felt precisely calculated. Everything in this space seemed to operate according to rules I hadn't been given, but was expected to follow nonetheless. The realization sat in my chest like something solid. The hallway, when I opened my door, was no longer empty. There were people now, a dozen of them, perhaps more. I couldn't quite count them because my eyes seemed to slide past certain figures and linger on others in a way I couldn't control. They moved with the purposeful distraction of a typical morning, walking between offices, holding coffee cups, speaking to one another in voices that were just loud enough to suggest conversation without ever resolving into actual words. I could hear the cadence of speech, the inflection, the occasional laugh, but the content remained precisely out of reach. One of them looked at me, a woman, or someone who presented as a woman, whose face I recognized in the way you recognize something from a dream after you've woken, not from memory, but from that deeper sense of having known it in some other state of consciousness. She smiled. It was a normal smile, entirely appropriate for a workplace hallway at 8 a.m. "Morning," she said, and her voice was the only thing I could understand all morning. 2 syllables, a greeting, nothing strange about it. I nodded and stepped into the corridor. The hallway was longer when I was inside it than it had appeared from the doorway. This was becoming a familiar principle. Spaces here seemed to calculate their dimensions based on some aspect of perception I couldn't fully account for. When I looked at them from a distance, they seemed reasonable. But once I was standing in them, they expanded. Not dramatically. Not in any way I could point to and say there, the hallway grew. Instead, it simply revealed that it had always been this long. The geometry was correcting itself in my presence. I walked toward the elevator. My feet knew the way, even though my mind was uncertain whether this was the correct direction. The rhythm of walking was hypnotic, step, 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 and it seemed to synchronize with the muted sounds around me. The footsteps of other people, the opening and closing of doors, the ambient hum of the building itself, a frequency I'd never noticed before, but which seemed to have always been present, waiting beneath the surface of ordinary office sounds. The elevator doors were visible now. They seemed closer than they should be, given how long I'd been walking. I pressed the button. The doors opened immediately. Impossibly immediately. There was no gap between the pressing and the opening. They seemed to have been in the process of opening already, as though they'd anticipated my arrival. Inside the elevator was the gray wall again. The same gray, the same texture. And something else. A message had been written on the wall. I knew this without seeing it clearly. The knowledge was simply present in my mind, the way you might know the answer to a question before you finished reading it. The message said something about numbers, about which floor I should go to, about where I needed to be. But when I looked directly at it, the writing dissolved into scratches and wear patterns indistinguishable from the ordinary erosion that a wall accumulates over time. I pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator began to descend, but the descent felt wrong. Not in any way I could articulate, but in the way that movement feels wrong when the speed doesn't match the distance. We should have been reaching the lobby. Floors should have been passing. But instead there was only a sense of dropping, of falling in a controlled and mechanical way while maintaining the illusion of purpose. The numbers above the door began to change, but they weren't descending. They were cycling through 17, 4, 23, 9, 17, again 8, 31. They moved too quickly to read with certainty, and I understood that they were never meant to be read. They were a performance of descent, not a record of it. When the doors opened, I was not in the lobby. I was in a hallway identical to the one I'd left on the 17th floor. Same carpet, same white walls, same series of doors, but there was no elevator behind me. The doors had opened directly into the hallway, and the space where the elevator should have been was occupied by a corridor that stretched backward into distance. My hands were shaking. This was the point where reasonable explanations should still have been possible. Malfunction, confusion, a building I'd never paid enough attention to, with layouts more complex than I'd assumed. But something in me had already moved past the capacity for these comfortable narratives. I could feel the shift happening in my chest, a tightening, a recognition, a kind of resignation that seemed almost relieved to stop pretending. I walked into this new hallway. The doors on either side bore names that I almost recognized, people I might have worked with, or people I'd imagined working with, or names that were simply close enough to actual names to suggest they might be real. Each door was closed. Each one was silent. At the end of the hallway, there was a window. Through the window, I could see another building. It was close enough to touch, perhaps 20 feet away, and it appeared to be identical to the one I was standing in. Same architectural style, same windows, same sense of contained functionality. And in one of the windows of that building, I could see a figure. A person standing at what might have been an office window, looking out at the building I was in. He was looking directly at me. I couldn't see his face clearly enough to make out features, but I could see his head turned slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement or perhaps of recognition. He didn't wave. He simply looked, and his attention felt like a weight, like something solid had reached across the gap between buildings and made contact with the back of my neck. I turned away from the window. The hallway had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that I could identify as a specific alteration, but the number of doors had increased. There were more of them now, or perhaps there had always been more, and I was only now beginning to notice. They extended further in both directions, receding into distances that seemed to extend beyond the physical bounds of the building itself. The woman from the 17th floor was standing in the middle of the hallway. She was facing away from me, looking at a door that I recognized as the one marked with my name, the wavering letters, the uncertain boundary between symbol and meaning. "You're still looking for your office," she said. She hadn't turned around. I hadn't heard her approach. "I need to leave," I said. My voice sounded strange in this hallway, flatter, as though the air itself was absorbing some of its resonance. "You're already on your way," she said. "You've been on your way since you parked your car." The weight in my hand returned then, the keys. I realized I was still holding them. I realized I couldn't remember arriving at the building. I couldn't remember entering the lobby. The first moment I could clearly remember was stepping out of the elevator on the 17th floor, and even that felt more like waking than like arriving. "How long have I been here?" I asked. She finally turned to look at me. Her expression was sympathetic in the way that a stranger's might be, polite, distant, entirely without connection. "Time moves differently here," she said. "You'll understand that soon." Behind her, the door with my name began to open, not from the inside, but from outside, as though something on the other side was pulling the door open by increments. The space within was darker than the hallway, but I could see movement there. Not movement from a person, but from the space itself, from the shadow and the distance. Something was shifting in that darkness, settling, making room. I backed away from her. I turned and walked in the opposite direction, moving deeper into the hallway, past doors I didn't recognize, toward a convergence point that I could sense but not yet see. The fluorescent lights above hummed in a frequency that seemed almost musical now. The carpet beneath my feet felt softer than before, or perhaps my feet were sinking into it slightly with each step. A subtle give that suggested my weight was accumulating in some way, that I was becoming heavier, or the building was becoming more substantial around me. The hallway began to narrow. I could perceive this change, feel it in the way my shoulders were no longer equidistant from the walls on either side. The space was constricting. Or I was moving toward a section of the building that had never been designed to accommodate a full-sized human body. The doors remained on either side, but they were smaller now, child-sized perhaps, or simply designed for entry by things that moved differently than I did. The fluorescent lights began to flicker, not all at once, but in sequence. A wave of darkness and light moving down the hallway ahead of me, punctuated by that humming frequency, which had resolved itself into something almost like speech, almost like words, almost like a language I might have spoken once, in some other context, in some other life. I stopped walking. Ahead of me, the hallway simply ended, not in a wall or a door or any physical barrier, but in an aperture, a kind of threshold that seemed to exist between the hallway and something else. The something else was obscured, not by distance or darkness, but by my own inability to perceive it. My eyes moved toward it and slid away. My mind could not settle on it. The space itself seemed to resist being understood. But I could feel the pull, a current almost physical, drawing the air in my direction toward that threshold. A gradient of pressure that suggested a transition from one kind of existence to another. My feet began to move forward again. I was no longer certain I was choosing this direction. The woman's voice echoed behind me from some enormous distance. Welcome back. You're going to be so much happier here. And the hallway, the building, the city beyond, everything I had been certain was real, began to feel thin, like paper, like a surface I might push through if I moved forward with enough conviction. I don't know how long I stood in that threshold. It might have been seconds. It might have been hours. Time had become unreliable, and I had stopped trying to measure it. What I remember is the sensation of standing between two states of being, one foot still in the hallway with its shrinking walls and its humming lights, one foot in something I couldn't name, couldn't see, couldn't afford to understand. And then a sensation like being pulled backward, like a current reversing, like water suddenly flowing the wrong direction, like waking, but not quite, like remembering something I hadn't yet experienced. I opened my eyes in the parking garage. My car was where I'd left it. The light was gray and uniform, the kind of light that exists in underground spaces, in places where the sun has never reached and never will. I was standing beside the driver's door. My hand was on the handle. I didn't remember walking back to the car. I didn't remember the journey from the threshold to here. There was an absence where those minutes or hours should have been, not a blank space, exactly, but a space that refused to cohere into memory. I drove home. The route was normal. The streets were normal. The other cars were normal. People returning from their days, from their offices and their meetings and their ordinary lives. I watched them from inside my vehicle and felt the distance between us like a physical thing. They had spent their day in one continuous line of time. They had not been stretched and thinned and rewoven. They had not stood in a threshold and felt the world become negotiable. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Coffee mug on the counter, still half full, still faintly warm. Laptop closed on the kitchen table, jacket hung on the back of the chair, everything in its place. The normalcy of it felt obscene. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to think about what had happened. This was when I realized that I couldn't, not clearly. The hallway existed in my memory, but it felt like a memory of a place I'd read about, not a place I'd been. The woman's face wouldn't resolve into a clear image. The door with my name on it seemed almost like a dream detail, the kind of thing that made perfect sense in sleep and fell apart in waking. But the feeling, that part remained absolutely intact. The feeling of being drawn toward something, the feeling of the air moving against my skin, the feeling of weight accumulating, the feeling of being in a place where the normal rules had been suspended, replaced by different rules that I had intuited rather than learned. I didn't go to work the next day. I called in sick, and it was almost true. Something felt wrong in my body, not painful, not obviously damaged, but wrong in the way that you feel wrong after anesthesia, after your body has been reset into a different baseline. I spent the day in my apartment, moving through the rooms, looking at things, trying to convince myself that they were solid and real and existed in a consistent timeline. By evening, I realized I was waiting for evening to arrive. I was dreading nightfall with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. I turned on every light in the apartment. I left them on as the sun set and the windows became mirrors. I could see myself reflected in the glass, and I looked almost like myself, almost like the person who had taken this route 1,000 times, almost like someone who had never stood in a shrinking hallway or met a woman who felt like an absence shaped into a person. I fell asleep on the couch with the television on, voices speaking to me from the screen in that generic, comfortable tone that television voices use. I don't remember my dreams, but I remember waking at 3 a.m. with the absolute certainty that I had been somewhere else. That even in sleep, something had been moving through my thoughts, rearranging them, leaving traces. The next morning, I returned to work. The office was exactly as it had always been. The same carpet, the same walls. The same fluorescent lights that cast that particular shade of institutional grayish white over everything. I kept my eyes down. I went to my desk. I opened my files. I tried to work, and I did work. I was functional enough that no one seemed to notice anything different. But I could feel it. The building around me felt thin. The walls seemed to be holding back something. The hallways, when I had to walk them, felt too long. I took a different route home that evening. I drove a way that added 15 minutes to my commute that took me through unfamiliar neighborhoods, past storefronts I'd never seen before, past intersections that seemed to exist in a kind of temporal lag where stoplights were perpetually about to change. It worked. I made it home without encountering anything that couldn't be explained. The next day, I took the same route, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each journey was fractionally safer. Each detour seemed to make the threat smaller, more distant. But I never forgot that the other route existed. I never forgot that if I took a wrong turn, or if a street was closed, or if my attention slipped for even a moment, I would find myself pulling into a parking garage that didn't look quite right, and the elevator doors would open, and no, I wouldn't let that happen again. But I had changed in ways that were becoming harder to hide. I noticed it when Sam from the cubicle next to mine asked me something, and I didn't respond immediately. I had been staring at the wall behind her, at the way the light caught the paint, at the minute irregularities in the surface. I had been trying to read something in those irregularities, some message or pattern that I'd seen before in that shrinking hallway. It took me too long to return to the present moment to remember what Sam had asked me. "Sorry," I said. "What was that?" She looked at me in a way that was almost, but not quite, the way the woman in the hallway had looked at me. I asked if you wanted to grab lunch. I said yes, but I didn't go. I sat at my desk during lunch hour while the office grew quiet and the lights seemed to press down harder. I opened my email and I saw an email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line, just a message in the body: time moves differently here. You're going to understand that so much better soon. I deleted it. My hands were shaking. I deleted it and emptied the trash and shut down my computer and told myself I had imagined it. It was a glitch, a spam email, a coincidence. It meant nothing. But I knew better. The thing about the threshold is that once you've seen it, once you've stood at the edge of it, it doesn't go away. It stays with you. It changes the way you perceive space, the way you perceive time, the way you perceive the consistency of the world around you. You start to see the places where reality wears thin. You start to notice the moments where the transition could happen again. In the space between sleep and waking, in the moment between one breath and the next, in the half second when you look away from something and then look back. I've developed routines to keep it at bay. I leave my apartment at the same time each morning. I take the same detour home. I drive slowly. I keep my eyes on the road. I don't take the parking garage elevator if I can help it. I use the stairs. The stairs feel more real somehow. The stairs are connected to the world in ways that elevators are not. Sometimes, when I'm driving, I'll notice that I've missed a turn, or that I've gone too far down a street that doesn't belong in my mental map of the city. My heart will begin to race, and I'll pull over and make a U-turn and find my way back to the familiar route. I don't know if these moments of disorientation are real or if I've simply become paranoid. If the hallway has infected my perception so thoroughly that I can no longer trust my own sense of direction. My coworkers have started to notice. Casey asked me if I was okay, and I said yes, I was just tired. Morgan suggested that maybe I should take some time off, and I laughed and said I was fine. I didn't need any time off. But I could see it in their faces, the concern, the worry that I was becoming someone they didn't recognize. I could #additional middle section. The highway began to feel smaller after the third week. Not visibly, the lanes were still 4 across, the median still wide and planted with those angular shrubs the state maintains. But there was a quality to the air now, a thickness that made the windshield feel like it was closing in, like I was driving through an increasingly narrow tunnel that only my eyes refused to acknowledge. I noticed the sky first. Not dark, not exactly. It was still daylight, still that flat gray-white of late afternoon, but it sat lower, closer to the asphalt. The kind of sky you see on days when you know a storm is coming, but the weather report swears nothing's there. I check my phone at red lights, thumb through the forecast. Clear, 73 degrees, no precipitation, but the sky pressed down anyway, and my shoulders would tense against the steering wheel. The other drivers never looked right. I became aware of this slowly, the way you become aware of a sound you've been hearing without noticing. They were there, cars in the other lanes, traffic solid enough that I couldn't speed, couldn't fall behind, but no one looked at anyone else. No one changed lanes casually. No one seemed to glance in a mirror. They drove with the fixed attention of people following instructions so precisely that deviation wasn't even considered. Their hands at 10 and 2. Their heads forward. It started to feel like watching something rehearsed, a tableau that held its shape only as long as no one acknowledged the scaffold underneath it. The radio became a problem around mile 70. Or maybe it had always been a problem and I was just now processing it. I'd cycle through stations, news, music, talk, and the signal would be strong, clear, but the content felt displaced somehow. A song would play that I recognized, but not quite. A female vocalist on a track I remembered as male. A fast song stretched into something slow. The news anchor would report on events that were vaguely familiar, reported slightly wrong, details shifted. A car accident in a city I knew, but on a street that didn't exist there. A weather warning for a town 40 miles in the wrong direction. I started leaving the radio off. The silence was worse. Inside the car, I became hyper-aware of textures. The steering wheel was textured rubber, but some days it felt almost tacky, like the finish was degrading. Other days it was smooth in ways rubber shouldn't be. I'd grip it and feel that wrongness travel up my arms. Not pain, not quite, but a kind of cellular disagreement, like my hands were registering something my mind wouldn't confirm. The seat beneath me was that standard gray fabric, but the temperature of it never matched the car's temperature. Cool when the sun was hot on the windshield, warm when I'd been sitting with the act running. It was as if the seat existed in a different climate than everything else. The mile markers became an obsession. I'd read them 127, 128, 129, normal progression. But sometimes I'd blink and we'd be at 128 again. Not doubled back, there was no memory of that, just somehow recycled. The mile marker 131 appeared twice in a row. I was certain of it. I'd noted the time, the position of the sun, 3 minutes between them. 3 minutes of highway that should have moved me forward, but instead had looped, had folded. When I tried to articulate this later to a friend, once before I stopped trying it sounded insane. Obviously, I'd miscounted. Obviously, my perception was off. But I hadn't miscounted. The landscape beyond the guardrails began to feel staged. Not that it looked fake, but rather that it existed with a quality of incompleteness. Trees that were the right height, but the wrong density. As if someone had planted ideas of trees rather than actual ones. Fields that were the correct color for the season, but laid too flat, too empty. A rest area that I passed, a standard one, the kind with tables and bathrooms that seemed to exist without context, placed down from above rather than grown into the landscape. No parking lot behind it, no connecting roads I could see. Just the structure sitting there, expectant. I stopped looking away from the road. My hands went numb sometimes. Not asleep, that particular prickling sensation was absent. Just absent. I'd flex my fingers and feel the movement in the abstract, the way you might feel your own movement if you were looking at yourself from outside your body. This happened most around the exit I was supposed to take, the one that led to my actual destination. As that exit approached, the numbness would intensify, spreading up my forearms. My feet would lose sensation in the pedals. I could still operate them, muscle memory perhaps, or something more automatic, but the feedback loop was broken. I'd press the accelerator and feel nothing, see the speed increase anyway. The light inside the car changed. Not the external light, which remained constant, but the quality of illumination inside the cabin. It had taken on a slightly blue tone, like I was driving inside an aquarium, like the air itself had opacity now. When I looked at my hands on the wheel, they seemed to be underwater. Not distorted, everything was clear, but lit as though through several feet of dark water. My skin looked whiter, the veins more pronounced. Like I was looking at something that was me, but from a perspective I'd never inhabited before. The highway stretched ahead in perfect perspective, the lanes converging toward a vanishing point that never arrived, always remaining exactly as distant as it had been the moment before. Eel the distance growing between me and the normal world. The world where people didn't stand in thresholds, where time moved in a single direction, where the walls of buildings stayed the same width throughout their entire length. 3 weeks have passed. The dreams have become more frequent, and in them I'm always in the hallway. In them, the doors are opening one by one, and I'm walking past them, reading the names, understanding finally that these are doors to other people's threshold moments. I see names I recognize, people I've worked with, people I've seen on the street, people who have the same worn-down look that I've started to see in my own reflection. And I understand, in the dream logic way that dreams have, that we're all waiting in that hallway. We're all being drawn towards some kind of convergence point. We're all standing at the edge of the same threshold, and we're all terrified and drawn and unable to turn away. When I wake from these dreams, I lie in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds of the building around me, the elevator moving through the shaft, the distant hum of traffic, the settling of the walls. I've begun to wonder if I ever truly left that hallway at all. I've begun to wonder if the threshold is not a doorway to somewhere else, but a doorway to a way of perceiving the world that, once opened, can never be fully closed. I've begun to wonder if the parking garage and the office and the drive home are all simply a different level of the hallway, a less obvious version, a version that looks like the normal world but is actually part of the same collapsing space, the same stretching and thinning, the same movement of something vast in the darkness just beyond the edges of perception. This morning, I pulled into the parking garage and I took the normal elevator. My hand was steady on the button. I rode up to my floor. I walked down the hallway to the office. I sat at my desk. And for just a moment, just long enough to make my breath catch, I saw something move in the space between the wall and the filing cabinet. Not a shadow, not a trick of light. Something with weight and presence. Something that recognized me. Something that was still waiting for me to find my way back. I looked away quickly. I focused on my work. I didn't move until the moment passed and the thing, whatever it was, settled back into the spaces between things, where it lives, where it waits, where it has always been waiting for the people who have already begun their journey into places they don't recognize. And I keep thinking about that elevator ride home tonight. I keep thinking about the parking garage. I keep thinking about whether I'll have the will to take the detour or whether just once my tired hands will guide the car toward the familiar route, the route that leads to places I've already been, places where the rules have changed, places where time moves differently, where I'm going to be so much happier once I stop fighting it. Story 2. The apartment next door has always been mine. Part 1, the hallway smells like radiator dust and something older, paint, maybe, or the slow decomposition of drywall into the air. I've learned the exact pitch of that smell over 3 years. It's the first thing I notice when I turn the key in my lock, before I step inside, before I see anything at all. My apartment is 4F. The one next to it, 4G, has been dark for as long as I've lived here. I know this seems like a small thing, an empty unit in a building that's mostly full. Mostly, but when you live alone as I do, when your life has contracted into a space so small and familiar that you know the exact moment the pipes shift in the walls. When you know the sound of your neighbor above walking from kitchen to bedroom, the specific creak of their floor, when you've learned the language of a building that way, the silence from 4G becomes a presence itself. Not in a dramatic sense. I'm not claiming I heard screams or anything theatrical like that. It was subtler. It was the knowledge that something was there that wasn't being used. The way a room feels different when it's abandoned. You know this feeling. A hotel corridor at 3 a.m, an office building after hours, all those desks waiting in the dark for hands that will come back. There's a quality to stillness like that. It's not peaceful. It's holding its breath. The first time I noticed the key thing was on a Wednesday in October, 2.5 years into living here. I'd returned my spare to the building superintendent, a woman named Casey who'd helped me move in, though I rarely saw her after that. She came and went at odd hours, always efficient, always distant. I'd given her the spare because I'd lost my original set at work, or I thought I had. Later I found them in my coat pocket, which bothered me more than it probably should have. But I'd already given the spare to Casey, and she'd said, "No problem, I'll keep it upstairs with the others," which is what she called them. The others. The spares. The keys to the units that turned over, that had people in them sometimes, and people out of them other times. The key I eventually kept was one I'd gotten duplicated at a hardware store nearby. It was a slightly different shade of bronze than the original, more golden, almost. I preferred it actually. It was easier to spot on my keyring in poor light. That evening I'd been coming back from work at around 8. I was walking down the hallway toward my door, thinking about nothing in particular. The kind of blank, exhausted thinking that characterizes most of my evenings when I noticed the mail slot in 4G's door. The mail slot was the kind you rarely see anymore, a horizontal brass slit that's been painted over so many times it barely opens. But you could see into it if you bent down. Inside, visible in the dark rectangle, was a pile, not a small pile, a significant one. Envelopes, packages, that kind of thing, compressed and aged-looking. I stood there with my key in my hand, still in my coat, dripping a little from the October rain outside. How long had that mail been sitting there? Weeks, certainly. Months, possibly. I knocked. I don't know why I knocked. I hadn't planned to knock, but I did. 3 short raps, as if I had any right to be curious about whatever waited behind that door. My knuckles made a sound that seemed to disappear as soon as it was made. The door absorbed it somehow, the way an empty apartment absorbs sound. Nothing happened. Of course, nothing happened. I went into my own apartment, 4F, directly across the hallway, and I made dinner. Pasta. The kind where you just boil water and add sauce from a jar, and I sat at my small kitchen table and I didn't think about it. Or I tried not to. But the knowledge was there, pressing at the edge of my attention the way an itch presses against the inside of your sock. 3 years living here, and I'd never thought much about who my neighbor was because there was no evidence of a neighbor. No sounds in the evening, no footsteps, no television playing through the walls, no music, no voices. The unit next to me was either empty or someone in 4G lived there in a state of absolute silence, absolute stillness, which seemed impossible. It was the mail that changed something. The mail made it real in a way that abstract knowledge couldn't. Someone had lived there. Someone still lived there, presumably. Someone was paying for the apartment. The building wouldn't allow that kind of accumulation if the rent wasn't being paid. Casey's maintenance of the hallway was too thorough for that. But also, no one came to collect the mail, which meant either they didn't care or they couldn't. Over the following weeks, I started to notice other things, small things. I'd be standing at my kitchen sink, looking out at the hallway through the small window I have there, a strange architectural feature. That window, almost like a porthole into the corridor outside. My sink faces inward toward the narrow alley between buildings, but I have a mirror hung above it, and in that mirror. If I angle my head just right, I can see my apartment door and part of the hallway beyond it. It was in that mirror that I noticed the light, not a constant light, not something you could plan around or predict, but occasionally, just occasionally, the crack under the door of 4G would brighten, as if someone inside had turned on a light or moved past a window or struck a match. A brief illumination, barely noticeable, the kind of thing you'd dismiss as a trick of your own tired eyes if you hadn't seen it multiple times. The light in 4G, appearing and disappearing. No pattern to it that I could detect. I started keeping a mental note. Tuesday evening around 9:30, I saw it. Then, not again for 4 days. Then, twice in one afternoon, both times very brief. Then nothing for 2 weeks. I found myself listening for sounds that might accompany these light changes, footsteps, the scrape of furniture, the opening of a door. But there was never any sound. Just the light, that sudden brightening of the darkness under the door, then gone. The building had its own sounds, of course. The pipes. Footsteps from above. The elevator, a sound like a patient animal sighing. the radiators clanking in the early morning when the heat came on, this background wash of apartment building noise that you stop hearing after a while, the way you stop hearing traffic if you live near a road. But nothing from 4G, nothing except that light. I told myself it was probably a timer. People used timers for security, didn't they? Lights on timers in empty apartments, making them seem inhabited when they weren't. It was a sensible explanation. It should have satisfied me. It didn't. The truth is, I'd started to think about the apartment constantly, in the way you think about something you don't want to think about, which is to say, the more actively you're not thinking about it, the more it occupies your mind. When I was at work, I found myself wondering what was happening in 4G. When I was eating, I wondered. When I was lying in bed at night, listening to the building settle around me, I wondered most of all. What was it doing? What was it waiting for? Why had no one ever collected that mail? And in the way of intrusive thoughts, increasingly insistent ones, who lived there? I'd learned the names of most of my neighbors by this point, or rather, I'd learned them by listening to how the building maintenance people referred to them. There was someone in 5B named Taylor, someone in 4D named Riley. I didn't know them personally. We passed in the hallway sometimes, exchanged the small nods that apartment dwellers exchange with each other, a mutual acknowledgement that we were each living our small separate lives in these stacked containers. But I'd never seen anyone associated with 4G, not once. I'd taken to watching more carefully. Not in a strange way. I wasn't standing in the hallway waiting for someone to emerge, but I became aware. In that passive way, you become aware of things you're not consciously focusing on, of the patterns of the building. Who left in the mornings, who came home in the evenings, the rhythm of doors opening and closing, footsteps, voices in stairwells. 4G had no rhythm. 4G had nothing except that occasional light, that accumulated mail, that smell of radiator dust when I stood near the elevator, and that quality of held breath that I've never been able to adequately describe to anyone. I considered mentioning it to Casey once. She was in the lobby one afternoon. I saw her checking something in the circuit breaker box, that small closet near the mailboxes that I'd always found vaguely threatening, though I couldn't explain why. Something about enclosed spaces where the building's infrastructure lived. Something about the smallness and darkness of it. I almost asked her. I almost said, "Is someone living in 4G?" But something stopped me. A sense that the question itself was wrong somehow, or that it would expose me to something I wasn't ready for. Instead, I said nothing, and I watched her work, and I collected my own mail from my own slot. Never very much of it, mostly catalogs and bills, and I went upstairs to my apartment. The mail in 4G was becoming more compressed, I noticed. Each day it seemed to settle lower in the space behind the door, compressed under its own weight and the weight of time. I wondered if I should say something to the building management. I wondered if there was something I was supposed to do about the situation, some civic responsibility I was neglecting. But what would I say? That there was mail piling up behind a door? That I'd never seen anyone go in or out? That sometimes I saw a light that might not have been real? It all sounded absurd when I tried to articulate it, even in my own mind. So I continued as I was. I went to work. I came home. I microwaved dinners and sat at my kitchen table and tried not to look in the mirror above my sink that showed me the hallway and the dark door of 4G. But of course, I looked. And of course, one evening in November, I saw something different. It was a Wednesday night, which is always quiet in the building. Most people work standard hours. And on Wednesday nights, you get that particular sense of people being tired, not yet at the weekend, at their lowest ebb of sociability. I was standing in my kitchen, not even consciously looking, just standing there while my kettle boiled, when I caught the movement. Movement inside 4G. Not a light this time. An actual shadow passing across the small window of the door itself. A shape. Something moving from left to right, just visible through the frosted glass pane. It wasn't large. It moved without hurry. And then it was gone. I stood very still with my hands on the edge of my counter, and I waited for my heart to stop doing whatever it had just started doing. Had someone just gone in? Had they been in there the whole time, moving through an apartment I thought was empty, living in that darkness while I lived in mine, separated only by a wall and a hallway? Or had I imagined it? The kettle clicked off. Steam rose from the water inside. I made my tea, and I didn't return to stand by the counter where I could see into the mirror. I sat in my living room instead. My living room is small. It's furnished simply, a couch that came with the apartment, or at least it was here when I moved in, so I assumed it came with it, a small armchair, a table with a lamp. The couch faces my front door and the wall beside it, which is the wall I share with 4G. I sat on my couch and I drank my tea and I listened. For a long time there was nothing, just the ordinary sounds of the building. The radiators, someone's television, very muffled, from somewhere above, the distant rush of water through pipes, and then something else, a sound in the wall between my apartment and 4G, not a vibration, not pipes, not settling wood, a sound like something being moved, something being shifted across a floor. Furniture, maybe, or boxes, or something else entirely, something I couldn't quite identify. The sound lasted for maybe 20 seconds. Then it stopped, and in the silence after it, I found I was holding my breath, and I didn't know when I'd started. I let the air out slowly and reminded myself that buildings were full of sounds. Buildings moved, pipes carried water, people walked around. There was nothing strange about hearing something through a wall. There was nothing strange about any of this, except that no one ever came to 4G. and no one ever left, and the mail kept accumulating, and I'd never, ever seen another human being emerge from that door until the following week when I made a discovery that changed everything. I'd gone out to the hallway to collect my recycling bin, which I kept outside my door because my apartment has no storage to speak of. It was a Sunday morning, and the hallway was empty as Sunday mornings tend to be, that quiet pause before the week starts again. I had my bin. I was heading back inside when I noticed something. A key, lying on the floor just in front of 4G's door. Not a brass key, a silver one, a modern key, the kind with a plastic head. I stopped. I looked down at it. It seemed impossible that it could just be there, lying in the exact middle of the hallway as if placed deliberately. I looked back at my apartment, then at 4G, then back down at the key. Someone must have dropped it. Recently, maybe very recently, as in, while I was outside collecting my bin, someone had dropped it. I picked it up. It was warm. That was the thing that struck me most immediately. It was warm, as if it had just left someone's hand. And I turned it over in my palm, looking at it more carefully. It was my building's key pattern. The design I recognized. The same angular cut that opened apartments in this building. My apartment included. I stood in the hallway for what felt like a long time, but was probably only seconds, holding this key, feeling the residual heat of it in my hand. I looked at my apartment door, at 4G, at the key. My mind was presenting me with scenarios, the way a mind does when something doesn't fit into established reality. Someone had dropped my key, which meant someone had taken my key, used it, and dropped it in the hallway. Or this was a spare key that Casey had given out, and someone had dropped it. Or this was something else entirely. I walked back to my door. I used my original key, the one I duplicated that was more golden in color, and I unlocked it. The lock clicked open. Everything was as it always was. My apartment, my small space, my couch, my life in its very contained form. I closed the door again without going inside. I walked back to 4G, and I held up the silver key I'd found, and I looked at the lock on 4G's door, and I suddenly, intensely needed to know. I slid the key into the lock. It fit. The mechanism was smooth. I could feel it settle into place, and when I turned it, when I felt the lock begin to give, I had a moment of such profound vertigo that I had to put my hand on the door frame to steady myself. I wasn't thinking about right or wrong. I wasn't thinking about legality or ethics or any of the reasons I shouldn't be about to do what I was about to do. I was thinking about 3 years. 3 years of living next to a space that shouldn't exist, a neighbor who had no shadow in the world, a door that never opened, that had no one behind it, that had accumulated the debris of time in its mail slot. I turned the key all the way. I felt the deadbolt slide back, and I pushed the door open. The smell that came out was my own smell, radiator dust. The faint metallic edge of winter heating, the particular air of an enclosed apartment that has been lived in but not ventilated, my smell, not the smell of some stranger's space. The hallway light coming in from behind me fell across the floor of 4G, and I saw that it was my apartment, not similar to my apartment, not arranged the same way, not with matching furniture. Not in the sense that apartments in the same building share a basic layout and therefore look somewhat alike. It was my apartment. The same radiator under the window. The same scuff marks on the wall from furniture moved and moved again. The same particular wear pattern on the floorboards. Even the same water stain on the ceiling in the corner. That brownish bloom that I'd been meaning to ask Casey about for 6 months. Everything exactly as I remembered it. Except I stepped inside and I closed the door behind me without thinking about it. It was dark in there. I reached for the light switch, the one that should be beside the door, and I found it and I turned it on. The light came on. Same bulb, same shade, same apartment. But it wasn't my apartment. My apartment was across the hallway. Wasn't it? I stood in the entrance of 4G and I tried to remember what my apartment looked like, tried to access the particular memory of it the way I knew it from 3 years of living inside it. And I could remember my furniture, my couch, the specific way the light came in through my kitchen window in the morning, my desk, the coffee stains on the counter from last Tuesday when I'd spilled the entire pot while on a call with work. But I was standing inside that apartment right now. I was looking at it. I was breathing its air. I could feel the slight warmth from the radiator on my left side, the way I could feel it in my own place. The same radiator. In the same spot, with the same gentle, almost alive ticking as it expanded with heat. My hand was still on the light switch. I hadn't moved. I told myself, "You're confused. You're tired. You went to the wrong door. This is someone else's apartment, and it just happens to look similar because the building has a standard layout. And you're tired, and it's dark, and your mind is playing games." But I knew my door. I knew my apartment number. I knew which key was on my ring because I'd used it 1,000 times. I had opened 4D, my apartment. I looked at the window. The fire escape was outside, the metal stairs catching the amber light from the street. Through the glass I could see the brick wall of the opposite building, the same brick wall I looked at every single morning while I drank my coffee and tried to wake up enough to face the day. This was my apartment. This was also the apartment next door. I walked deeper inside without deciding to. My feet just moved. The floorboards beneath me made the same sounds they always made. A soft creak near the bedroom door, a harder pop somewhere under the kitchen tile. I knew these sounds. I'd heard them in the dark at 3 in the morning when I couldn't sleep, when the building was silent enough to hear every settling of its old bones. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it. The coffee maker on the counter. The dish rack by the sink with the same 3 mugs sitting in it, handles all facing the same direction, because I'd learned a long time ago that symmetry made the space feel slightly less chaotic. The small cutting board propped against the wall where I always left it. Even the calendar on the refrigerator was the same one. Still open to 3 months ago because I'd never bothered to flip it forward. I opened the refrigerator. The light came on. Inside, I saw my food, the same containers, the same half-empty juice carton, the same takeout box from that Thai place on Amsterdam Avenue, the one I'd ordered from on Friday night and kept meaning to throw away. It was covered in a light fuzz of mold now. I could smell it even from here, that particular sour smell of food that had started to remember what it was made from. I closed the refrigerator. My heartbeat was very loud. I could hear it in my ears like someone tapping a rhythm on the inside of my skull. I walked to the bedroom. The bed was unmade, the sheets twisted in a way that was specific to the way I slept, tangled and restless, always ending up with the blankets in a spiral by morning. My clothes were draped over the chair in the corner, the same clothes I'd worn yesterday or the day before. The days were starting to blur together now that I thought about it. I could see my phone on the nightstand. It was dark, uncharged. I could see the charger coiled on the floor beside the bed, where I'd pulled it free last night and forgot to plug it back in. My mind was doing something strange. It was trying to divide itself. One part of me was saying, "This is your apartment. You live here. You know this place. This is 4D, your home, the space you've inhabited for 3 years." The other part was saying, "You left this apartment. You crossed the hallway. You used a key on the door marked 4G. You entered a space that was not your own." Both things were true. Both things could not be true. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my bed, the bed I recognized, the bed with the small stain on the fitted sheet from something I'd spilled weeks ago and hadn't quite managed to get out completely. I sat down and I tried to think through this in a linear way, the way a person thinks when they're trying to solve a problem. I had lived in apartment 4D for 3 years. The apartment across the hall had been empty for all of that time. I had never seen anyone enter or leave it. No one had ever moved anything into it. The mail slot had accumulated the debris of seasons. No one had ever even cleaned the space. But I had opened the door marked 4G, and I was inside my apartment, which meant either A, I had somehow misremembered which apartment was mine, and 4G was my home all along, which was impossible because I had a lease with my name on it, signed 3 years ago, and I had paid my rent every month to the landlord with a check that said 4D in the memo line. Or B, my apartment existed in two places and I was currently in the wrong one. Or C, I was not thinking clearly and something in my mind had simply broken. I didn't like any of these options. I stood up and walked back to the main room. I went to the door and opened it. The hallway was still there, the same hallway, dim and familiar, with the radiator pipes running along the wall and the door to 4D directly across from where I was standing. My door, my actual door, sitting there in the building like it had always been there. I stepped back into the hallway. I let the door to 4G, no, the door to my apartment, the one that didn't exist, swing closed behind me. I heard the latch click. I walked across the hallway. I used my key. I opened the door to 4D. And I stepped inside. The apartment I stepped into was identical to the one I just left. Same radiator. Same scuff marks. Same water stain in the ceiling corner. Same living room with the same couch in the same position. Same kitchen with the same coffee maker and the same 3 mugs in the dish rack and the same moldy takeout box in the refrigerator. I checked the bedroom. Same unmade bed. Same twisted sheets. Same clothes on the chair. Same phone, dark and uncharged, sitting on the nightstand. I stood in the center of my apartment, or an apartment that was perfectly, impossibly my apartment, and I tried to think of what to do. The sensible thing would have been to call someone, to call Casey, my landlord, to report that something was wrong. But I didn't. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was because I knew how it would sound. Maybe it was because some part of me knew that no one would be able to help me. Maybe it was because the first thing I needed to do was understand what was happening, and I could do that better alone. I sat on the couch. I didn't turn on the television. I just sat there in the quiet of my apartment, one of my apartments, or both of them, or neither, and I waited for something to make sense. It didn't. The light outside the window changed gradually from the amber of early evening to the deeper orange of dusk. The radiator ticked and settled. Somewhere in the building, I heard a door close. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Normal sounds. The sounds of a building full of people living ordinary lives, unaware that the space around them was beginning to bend in ways that had no explanation. I thought about going across the hallway again. I thought about trying the other door, the one marked 4G, to see if perhaps it had changed, if perhaps the apartment beyond it would be different now, would be empty or different or anything other than exactly what it had been before. But I didn't go. I realized, sitting there on the couch in my apartment, that I was afraid, not of what I might find, but of what I might find that was the same. I was afraid of the confirmation that something was fundamentally wrong with the space around me, that the rules of the world I understood were no longer in effect. The darkness deepened. Night came. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat there and let the apartment fill with shadow, and I tried to remember which version of my life was the real one. After a long time, I'm not sure how long, because I wasn't tracking it, I realized I was hungry. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten. I got up and walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, and I looked at the food inside, and I couldn't bring myself to eat any of it. It all felt like it belonged to a different version of me, a version that had made different choices about what to consume, when to consume it, how to live in this space that was and wasn't mine. I closed the refrigerator. I heard the sound then. It came from outside, from the hallway, a key sliding into a lock. I froze. I stood in the kitchen of my apartment, and I listened as someone opened the door to 4G. I heard them step inside. I heard them turn on a light. I heard someone moving around in the apartment that was exactly like mine. Someone else was living there, or had always been living there, or was living in all versions of it at once, moving through copies that shouldn't exist, inhabiting the space the way it had always inhabited me. I didn't go to the door. I didn't look out into the hallway. I stood in the kitchen and I listened to the sounds of someone else moving through a space that was exactly like the one I was standing in, and I understood, in a way that had no words and required no explanation, that I was no longer alone in my apartment. I had never been alone in my apartment. There was always someone across the hallway. And now we both knew it. The sounds from 4G stopped, not gradually. Abruptly, as if whoever was moving around in there had heard something. The sharp intake of my breath, perhaps, or the unconscious shift of my weight, and had frozen in response. I stood motionless in my kitchen. The darkness pressed against me from all sides. My apartment had no lights on, and the ambient glow from the city outside the windows had dimmed enough that I could barely see the outline of the refrigerator, the shape of my own hand in front of my face. Then I heard the apartment door across the hallway open again. Not the sound of it unlocking, the sound of it opening, slow and deliberate. Whoever was in 4G was coming out. I heard their footsteps in the hallway. They moved toward my door. I found myself holding my breath. My chest felt tight. The sound of my own heartbeat seemed loud enough to fill the space, loud enough to be heard through the walls, loud enough to announce my location to whatever was out there. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I waited. I don't know for how long. Time had become slippery. It might have been seconds. It might have been longer. The silence stretched itself out, became a living thing, became something that occupied the space between my door and where I stood frozen in my kitchen. Then I heard it. Not a knock. Not the sound of someone trying the doorknob. Something quieter and more specific, the sound of something sliding under my door. Paper or envelope or card. something thin and deliberate. I didn't move. I stood there and I watched as the envelope, if that's what it was, appeared beneath my door like a message from the other side of a border I hadn't known I'd crossed. The footsteps retreated. They walked back across the hallway. The door to 4G opened, then closed, and the light from inside went out, and the hallway returned to its ordinary darkness. I walked to the door slowly. My legs felt uncertain, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who wasn't sure if they wanted to walk forward or backward or stay perfectly still. I knelt down and I looked at the thing that had been slipped under my door. It was an envelope. Standard white. No markings on it. Inside was a key. I held it between my fingers and I stared at it. It was warm. Not body warm, I'm not exaggerating or being poetic. It was warm in a way that suggested it had just been held, just been carried, just come from somewhere that retained heat. The key was brass-colored, ordinary, the kind of key that could fit any number of locks, the kind of key that might open a door to an apartment or a building or a mailbox or nothing in particular. But I knew with a certainty that bypassed all rational thought that this key was meant to open something specific. This key was a message, an invitation, a demand. I went to the window. I pressed my face against the glass and I looked out at the street below. The usual nighttime emptiness. A few cars parked at the curb, a street light casting its pale orange glow across the pavement. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the world outside had changed, or had ever changed, or had ever been anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. But inside, everything was different. I turned away from the window and I looked at the door to my apartment. It stood closed, as it always did. Solid, real A boundary between my space and the rest of the building. I walked toward it. I don't know if I was going to open it or not. I don't know what I was going to do with the key. But I found myself standing in front of the door, key in hand, and I was reaching for the lock, and then I heard something that stopped me. It came from inside my apartment, from deeper inside, from the direction of my bedroom. A sound like breathing, not my breathing. I was holding my breath, had been holding it for so long that my lungs burned with the need to release it. This was someone else's breathing. Someone else in my apartment. Someone who had always been in my apartment, perhaps, waiting in the darkness of the bedroom for me to acknowledge their presence. I turned around slowly. The hallway into my apartment was dark. The bedroom door was closed, as it always was. But the darkness seemed different now. It seemed to have a texture to it, a weight. The kind of darkness that doesn't just represent the absence of light, but the presence of something else. The breathing continued. Steady, calm, patient. I realized in that moment that I wasn't sure if the breathing was coming from the bedroom or from the apartment across the hallway, or from both places at once. The sound had a quality to it that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere seemed to exist in the walls themselves. I looked down at the key in my hand. The metal seemed to have cooled slightly, but it was still warm, still carrying that sense of having been held moments before, still carrying the warmth of whoever had left it there. I understood, suddenly, that the key wasn't meant to open something in the hallway or in another apartment. It was meant to open something in my apartment. Something I hadn't known was locked. Something that had been waiting for me to find the key. The breathing from the bedroom continued, steady and patient and utterly inhuman in its perfect regularity. I walked toward the bedroom door. Each step felt significant, weighted with consequence. Each step was something I was doing, and something that was being done through me, as if my body had become a doorway for someone else's will. I reached for the doorknob. Before my fingers touched it, the door swung inward on its own. The bedroom was dark, but not empty. There was a shape there, a figure, standing at the foot of the bed, facing away from me toward the window. I couldn't make out details. The darkness was too complete, too absolute, but I could see the general outline. Human, the shape of a person. They didn't turn around. They didn't acknowledge my presence. They simply stood there, and they continued breathing that same steady, patient, mechanical breath. I wanted to back away. I wanted to return to the couch, to sit down, to pretend that none of this was happening. But my body didn't obey that impulse. Instead, I found myself stepping into the bedroom, found myself closing the distance between myself and the figure at the foot of my bed. "Who are you?" I heard myself ask. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, not quite like my own voice. It sounded like the voice of someone speaking through water or through a thick barrier of sound. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just continued that steady breathing. I moved closer. I was maybe 5 feet away from them now, close enough that I should have been able to see more detail, but the darkness seemed to resist my vision, seemed to press against my eyes and prevent me from seeing more than the bare outline of human shape. And then the figure turned its head. Slowly, deliberately, its face was hidden in shadow. I couldn't see its features, but I could feel its eyes on me, could feel them moving across my face, my body, as if reading something written on my skin. When it spoke, the voice was mine, not an imitation of my voice, not someone doing an impression. It was my voice exactly, with all my inflections, all my rhythms, all the specific characteristics that made me identifiable as myself. "You finally found the key," it said, and I understood. The apartment across the hallway wasn't separate from mine. There had never been a door between them, or the doors were all the same door, all connecting to the same space, and what I'd been walking through all this time wasn't hallways between apartments, but layers of the same room folded into itself, reflected back on itself, existing in multiple versions simultaneously. And the person standing at the foot of my bed in the darkness was me, a version of me, or all versions of me, or the thing that lived inside me, that had always lived in my apartment because the apartment and I were not separate things. "What do you want?" I asked. My double turned back to face the window. It raised one hand and placed it against the glass. From the angle where I stood, I couldn't see if the glass was solid or not. I couldn't see if the hand went through it. "I want to know which one is real," it said, using my voice, my cadence, my exact words, the way I would have spoken them. And I understood that I was looking at myself, that I had always been looking at myself, that the apartment had never changed, but I had. I had multiplied, or been divided, or had always been existing in multiple versions simultaneously, and only now was I beginning to perceive the truth of what I was. The breathing continued, steady, patient, and I realized that I couldn't tell anymore if I was the one breathing, or if it was my double, or if we were breathing together, our lungs synchronized, our bodies connected by something that had no words and required no explanation. The key was still in my hand. The brass was cold now. Whatever had warmed it before was gone, or had never existed except as something I perceived. "Open it," my double said, and it wasn't a request. I turned and walked back through the doorway of my bedroom back into the hallway of my apartment, and I approached the apartment door. But as I did, I realized I wasn't sure anymore which apartment I was in. The hallway seemed longer than before, the walls closer, the air thicker. The door stood in front of me. But I couldn't remember if it was my door or 4G's door. I couldn't remember if there was a difference anymore. I raised the key. The lock on the door seemed to watch me, seemed to open and close of its own accord, as if breathing. And somewhere in the building, in all the apartments that might or might not exist, in all the hallways that might or might not connect, I heard another key being turned in another lock, and I knew, with a certainty that filled me with something far deeper than fear, that my double was entering another version of my apartment. And we were getting closer together, and soon we would meet not in hallways or between doors, but in the same space at the same moment, and I would finally understand which one of us was real, or if perhaps we both were, or if perhaps we never had been. Hashtag the apartment next door has always been mine for. I don't know what happened to the key. That's what I remember most clearly, which probably tells you something about how fragmented everything else has become. I remember the weight of it in my palm, the cold brass, the sound it made against the lock, a sound that was both impossibly loud and completely silent, the way sounds are in dreams, existing somewhere between your ear and your thought. And then, nothing. A gap, not a blackout exactly, more like the gap between frames of film. Consciousness didn't stop, it just skipped. The next thing I was aware of with any certainty was sunlight on my face. Morning, my bedroom. I was lying on top of the covers, fully clothed. The window was open maybe 3 inches. I have no memory of opening it. The curtains moved slightly with the breeze, and dust moved through the light in that slow, deliberate way it does when you've stopped looking at it long enough to actually see it move. I lay there for a long time, not because I was afraid to move, but because moving seemed to require a conversation with myself about whether I actually existed in a singular, continuous way. And I wasn't ready to have that conversation. I needed to just exist first, just breathe and not think about whether the breathing was mine or something else's. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that lives in old buildings during the middle of the day, when everyone is somewhere else, when the walls and pipes have nothing to communicate except their own settling. I could hear the fridge in the kitchen, its steady hum a kind of proof. I could hear traffic from the street far below, normal sounds. The sounds of a normal day in a normal apartment where normal things were happening. I sat up slowly. The bedroom looked exactly as it always had. My books on the nightstand, the lamp I'd bought last spring, the small crack in the corner of the ceiling that I'd been meaning to call the landlord about for 6 months. Everything was exactly where it should be. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. And yet, the room felt different in a way I couldn't articulate. Not haunted, that's too dramatic, too loaded with meanings that don't quite fit. It felt like a room that was pretending to be a room, like something was happening just outside the range of my perception, something very still and very patient, waiting for me to stop looking at it directly. I didn't check the hallway that day, or the next day. I moved through my apartment like someone navigating a space that had become partially unfamiliar, not avoiding certain paths exactly, but moving them with a kind of caution. I didn't open the front door. I didn't look through the peephole. And I realized that I had no idea how many apartments were in this building. I've lived here for 3 years, and I have never bothered to count them. Sometimes, late at night, I hear other keys turning. Different locks, different timing, but always with that same patient, methodical quality, like someone is slowly, systematically checking every apartment, every version of every hallway, looking for something specific, looking for me maybe, or looking for themselves. I don't check the peephole anymore. I've covered it with a small piece of tape on the inside, which doesn't block the view from the outside, but it keeps me from being tempted to use it. There's a difference between knowing something is there and looking at it. The scratch on the kitchen counter hasn't gotten any bigger. But I notice it every time I'm in there. And every time I notice it, I have to resist the urge to trace my finger along it, to see if it goes deeper than it looks, to see if there's something on the other side that's trying to reach through. The key is still gone. I've accepted that I won't find it. It served its purpose, whatever that was, and then it removed itself from the world. Or maybe it's still here and I've just become unable to perceive it. Maybe it's sitting on my bedside table or on my kitchen counter, and I walk past it every day without seeing it, the way you can look at something 1,000 times and never actually see it. The apartment and I coexist now in a kind of negotiated silence. I don't ask what it wants. I don't ask which version of me is real, or if all versions are equally real, or if the concept of singularity has become meaningless in a space like this. I've stopped trying to map the distances. I've stopped trying to count the doors or determine which ones connect to which hallways. I just move through it, or it moves through me. It's become hard to distinguish. And I let the moments accumulate the way they always have. But sometimes, in that space between sleep and waking, when my defenses are lowest and my perception is most fluid, I feel it watching me from across the room. And I know, with a certainty that no longer frightens me, but instead settles into my bones like something that's been there all along, waiting for me to finally acknowledge it. There is someone standing at the foot of my bed. They have my face. They have my hands. They have my breath, my silence, my accumulation of days and weeks and years. And they're looking at me the way I look at them, trying to figure out which one of us is the reflection and which one is the original. And maybe, just maybe, that question stopped meaning anything the moment I turned the key in that lock, or the moment the key was turned for me, or the moment the key was waiting in my hand, patient and inevitable, for a version of me that finally understood what I was. The apartment is very quiet tonight. I can hear someone breathing in the dark, but I can't tell if it's me anymore. Story 3. I can't remember if I ever left the office yesterday. The first thing I noticed was the quality of the light. It was coming through the bedroom window at that particular angle, steep, morning bright, full of dust motes that hung suspended in the air like they'd been waiting for me to notice them. I lay still for a moment, watching them move or not move. I couldn't quite tell. My eyes felt heavy in a way that suggested I hadn't slept well, or perhaps hadn't slept at all. I turned my head slowly. The clock on my nightstand read 7:14 a.m. That was when the first real uncertainty arrived. Not like a sudden realization, more like a thought that had been sitting just outside my awareness, finally stepping into view. I couldn't remember getting home, not the end of the day, not the drive, not even the decision to leave. I remembered sitting at my desk, the blue glow of the monitor washing everything in that particular shade of institutional gray-blue that office lighting produces. I remembered the hum of the building, that low, constant thrum of the HVAC system that becomes almost hypnotic if you notice it too directly. I remembered the texture of my keyboard beneath my fingers, the weight of my shoulders, the slight sting in my eyes from staring at spreadsheets for hours. But the space between that moment and waking here, in my bed, with the morning sun on my face, that was gone. I sat up slowly, the sheets moving with a soft whisper of fabric. My apartment was quiet in that particular way apartments are quiet in the early morning before the city has fully woken, the kind of quiet that feels expectant. I could hear the distant sound of traffic on the street below, the indistinct murmur of the city starting its day without me. I stood and walked to the window. The street was wet from rain I didn't remember falling. The cars parked along the curb had that glossy appearance they get when they've been rained on, and the sidewalk was darker than it should be. A few people were already moving along the street with the brisk efficiency of people who had somewhere to be. None of them looked up at my window. I was wearing the same clothes I'd worn to the office yesterday. Or what I thought was yesterday. The gray button down, the black slacks. I could smell the office on them. That particular combination of recirculated air, furniture polish, and the faint plastic tang of equipment that's been running all night under fluorescent lights. My jacket was draped over the chair in the corner of the bedroom, exactly where I always put it. When I walked over and felt in the pocket, my work badge was there. The laminated card felt cool and smooth in my palm. My photo stared up at me, a face that looked like mine but somehow slightly wrong, the way photos always do. Name, employee ID, barcode, the date I was hired. I turned the card over in my hands. The back was blank except for the magnetic strip, unmarked and impersonal. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it. Or rather, it was exactly as kitchens that aren't visited for a while look. There was a mug in the sink, my mug, the one with the chipped handle that I'd been using for coffee for months. The inside was stained brown with the ghost of old coffee. I had no memory of washing it and putting it there, no memory of using it after the office. I opened the refrigerator. The light inside was bright and cold. Leftover containers with dates written on their lids in my handwriting. Milk that I would need to smell before I used. A bottle of water with condensation beading on its surface. Everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as the contents of a refrigerator ever seemed to anyone living alone. But I couldn't remember buying any of it. I found myself standing in the middle of my kitchen, holding my work badge in one hand, trying to mentally trace the path from my desk to here, from the office to home. The memory wasn't there. It was like trying to remember a dream after you've been awake for too long. The more you tried to grasp it, the faster it dissolved. I made coffee. The act of it was grounding, filling the maker with water, measuring out the grounds, pressing the button, and listening to the machinery inside begin its ritual. The smell of brewing coffee is almost universally comforting, and yet as I stood there in my small kitchen, watching the dark liquid drip into the pot, I felt something that was almost the opposite of comfort. It was familiarity undercut with strangeness, like visiting a childhood home and finding that the dimensions of the rooms had changed slightly. While the coffee finished brewing, I went back to the bedroom and changed out of my office clothes. I pulled on jeans and a sweater, socks with no holes in them. I performed these actions like someone following a script, each movement deliberate and conscious. In the shower, I let the hot water run over my face for longer than usual, as if I could rinse away the previous day and start it fresh. But the memory didn't return. By 8:30 a.m., I was sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling in front of me and my work badge placed carefully on the surface. I was staring at it the way you might stare at a piece of evidence, trying to make it tell me something it hadn't already revealed. The question, growing more insistent now, was whether I should call the office. Not because I was worried about anything, not yet, but because I needed to confirm something. I needed to hear a familiar voice, see the day unfold around me in a way that made sense. I had been working at that company for 3 years. I knew the office the way you know a place you visit every day, not through conscious observation, but through the accumulated weight of routine. The hallways, the smell of the break room, the particular texture of the carpet in the cubicle area, the way my desk was arranged, the view from my window, 4th floor, looking out at other buildings and the gray sky. I should have been there, or I had been there. The logical thing to do was to check my email. My laptop was on the desk in the living room, closed and dark. I opened it and watched it come to life, going through its boot sequence. While I waited, I looked around the living room, trying to see it with fresh eyes, trying to notice if anything was out of place. The couch was where it always was, the small bookshelf with its random collection of books I'd accumulated over years. A framed photo of myself with Alex and Jordan, friends from college, a trip to the beach that I could remember very clearly, the sand warm and the water surprisingly cold. That photo had been sitting on that shelf for at least a year. When the laptop finally opened, I navigated to my email. The inbox was full of the usual accumulated messages, meetings scheduled for the future, a few spam emails that had made it past the filter. And then, scrolling back, I found the last email I'd sent yesterday afternoon. It was to my supervisor, Jennifer, sent at 4:47 p.m. The subject line was, Q3 report ready for review. So I had been there. I had been working. I had been functional enough to complete a project and summarize it in a professional email, but I couldn't remember any of it. I read the email carefully as if it had been written by someone else. The language was mine. The same slightly formal tone I used at work, the same way of structuring information, but it felt like something excavated from someone else's life. I've completed the reconciliation of figures from the past quarter and compiled them into the attached spreadsheet. All variances have been noted and explained in the column headers as discussed. Ready to present to the team whenever you'd like. 4:47 p.m. That was late in the day, but not unusually so for me. I often stayed past 5. What came after 4:47 p.m. was the blank space, the missing section. I closed the laptop and sat back, the leather of the chair creaking slightly beneath me. The coffee had gone cold. Outside the window, the morning was progressing. A delivery truck was parked on the street below. A woman with a stroller was walking past on the sidewalk. The normal progression of time, carrying everyone else along with it. I picked up my phone and checked the battery. It was at 34%, which seemed odd because I usually charged it at night and I had no memory of using it this morning. I opened my call history. The last call I'd made was to my apartment's building maintenance 3 days ago to report that the kitchen sink was draining slowly. No calls to anyone yesterday. No text sent after that email to Jennifer. The sensible thing would have been to assume I'd simply had a bad night's sleep, that my memory was being affected by fatigue or stress. The sensible thing would have been to get in my car, drive to the office, and see what had actually happened, to ground myself in the reality of the building, the people, the physical evidence of my presence there. But something was stopping me. Some small resistance that I couldn't quite articulate. Instead, I decided to look around my apartment more carefully. Not in a panicked way, but methodically. I went through the living room first, then the bedroom, then back to the kitchen. I was looking for something that would tell me when I'd arrived home, or if I'd arrived home at all. In the kitchen, I found something. On the small shelf above the refrigerator, the place where I kept things I didn't really need but also didn't want to throw away, there was a pen. A silver ballpoint pen with the company logo on it, the words printed in small letters, Hartwell Financial Solutions. It was from the office. I definitely didn't remember bringing that home. I never brought things home from the office. I didn't bring work with me into my personal space. That was one of the few boundaries I'd managed to maintain over the years, the separation between the two places, the two versions of myself. I picked up the pen and examined it. It was completely ordinary. The kind of pen that was manufactured in bulk and given out at office events or just left in stacks on desks for anyone to take. There was nothing remarkable about it except that I couldn't remember acquiring it. I set it down and continued looking. Under the sink, in the cabinet with the cleaning supplies, I found a sticky notepad. It was small, the kind you could fit in a pocket. The logo on the back was the same: Hartwell Financial Solutions. The top note in the pad had something written on it in handwriting that looked like mine, but that I couldn't quite read. I pulled the note off carefully. The writing was, "Remember to check the—" That was all. The sentence cut off mid-word, either because the note had been replaced before I finished, or because I decided not to finish writing it. I turned the note over. There was nothing on the back. I found a total of 7 office-related items in my apartment, each one discovered in a different location, each one placed somewhere that suggested I'd set it there deliberately. Yet each one completely absent from my memory. Another sticky notepad, still in its plastic wrapping, on the shelf in the bedroom closet. A stress ball with the company name printed on it, shoved in the back of the kitchen junk drawer beneath the cooking utensils. A USB drive in a small cardboard sleeve sitting next to my laptop. 2 pens, identical to the first one. A lanyard with the company name printed on it, coiled on top of the refrigerator. By the time I'd found them all, it was past noon. The morning light had shifted slightly, angling down into the apartment from a different direction. The dust motes had disappeared from the window, or perhaps I'd simply stopped noticing them. I sat on my bed with all the objects arranged in front of me, laid out like the contents of a purse or the inventory of a robbery. They were all things that meant nothing on their own. They were the kind of corporate giveaways that accumulated in offices given out so regularly that no one really thought about them. But the fact that they were here, in my apartment, hidden in various locations like gifts or evidence, that meant something. The rational explanation was simple. I had picked them up at some point and brought them home without consciously registering that I'd done so. People did that. You could have a whole conversation with someone and not remember it later. You could do things automatically and then have no memory of doing them. But these things weren't scattered. They were placed, arranged in specific locations. The way you'd place something if you wanted to remember it later, or if you wanted someone else to find it. The way you'd place something if you weren't sure whether you'd actually left your office at all. By the time this thought occurred to me, the light outside was beginning to change again. The sun was moving toward afternoon. I'd lost track of time looking at these objects, trying to assemble them into some kind of coherent narrative. I picked up my phone and opened my email again. I read Jennifer's response to the report I'd sent at 4:47 p.m. It had arrived at 5:22 p.m. yesterday. Great work, Morgan. This is thorough and well organized. I'll take a look and we can discuss in our meeting next week. A normal email. The kind of email that my supervisor would have sent if she'd read the work I'd submitted and was satisfied with it. No indication that anything unusual had happened. No indication that I hadn't made it home, unless home was something I was constructing in my mind. Unless the apartment around me, the coffee I'd made, the clothes I was wearing, unless all of it was as insubstantial as a dream. The thought arrived fully formed. What if I never actually left the office at all? Not that I'd fallen asleep at my desk and then woken in my bed with false memories. That didn't make sense. But what if the space between there and here had been filled in somehow? What if my mind had constructed this whole morning, this whole apartment, this whole day out of the materials available to it? I stood up too quickly, and the objects in front of me scattered slightly. The pens rolled across the bedspread. The stress ball fell onto the carpet. I needed to go back to the office. I needed to check. I needed to walk those hallways again and feel their familiar dimensions and confirm that the office was real, that yesterday had actually happened, that I had actually left at some point and made it home to this apartment where I was now, standing in the afternoon light, unable to remember how I'd gotten here. I changed back into my office clothes, the same ones I'd slept in, now slightly wrinkled. I put the work badge back in my jacket pocket. I checked that I had my car keys and my wallet and my phone. My apartment looked exactly the same as it always did. The morning coffee cup was still in the kitchen sink. The dust was still motes in the air, or perhaps it was different dust, particles in a different configuration. A different apartment pretending to be the same one. The question that followed me down the hallway toward the elevator was this: if I went to the office and looked at my desk, would I find the coffee mug that was supposed to be in my kitchen? And if I did, what would that mean? The elevator doors opened when I pressed the button. They closed when I stepped inside. The descent took the usual amount of time. When they opened again, I was in the lobby of my building, which looked exactly as it always did, with the same potted plant by the main door that always seemed to be dying and yet never quite dead. Outside, the street was still wet from rain. I didn't remember falling. My car was parked in its usual spot, 3 blocks away in the parking garage. The walk there felt longer than usual, or perhaps I was just walking more slowly, paying more attention to the details. The sidewalk, the storefronts, the people passing by, none of whom looked at me or seemed to acknowledge that I existed. The car was cold inside. The steering wheel was cold under my hands. I started the engine and checked the odometer. 8,427 miles. I knew this number. I'd checked it yesterday, or what I thought was yesterday. It hadn't changed, which meant I hadn't driven the car since when? Since yesterday? Since the day before that? The drive to the office should take about 15 minutes in light traffic. It took me through the downtown area, past the river, up to the business district where the towers began to cluster together. I knew this route by heart. I'd driven it hundreds of times. As I drove, I kept checking the mirror, not for traffic, but to see if the city behind me was really there or if it was being constructed as I moved away from it, painted into existence just in time for me to see it and then dissolved into nothing once it was out of my field of vision. The sun was lower now, moving toward evening. Soon it would be the time of day when I usually left the office. Soon I would be able to see what was waiting for me there. The parking garage loomed up ahead of me, the entrance a dark mouth in the side of the building. I took the ticket from the machine, it was warm in my hand, and drove down into the levels below, where everything was fluorescent and gray and smelled the way all parking garages smell. My spot was on level B2. I parked there and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, looking at the concrete wall in front of me, the painted lines, the solidity of it all. Then I got out and walked toward the elevator that would take me back up into the building. The elevator doors opened to a lobby I recognized but couldn't quite place. The tiles were the right color, a dusty beige that had been trendy 10 years ago, but something about their arrangement felt unfamiliar. The reception desk was there, behind its curved laminate counter, but the woman sitting at it wasn't the usual receptionist. She had the same dark hair, the same approximate build, but her face was turned slightly away, angled so that I couldn't quite see her features clearly. When I passed, she didn't look up. The elevator to the office floors was the one on the left. I'd taken it thousands of times. I pressed the button for the 14th floor and felt the familiar lurch as the cable engaged. Between the 7th and 8th floors, the elevator stopped. No alarm sounded. No emergency light flickered on. It simply stopped, and the doors remained closed. I waited, watching the numbers on the digital display. 78, 78, 78. The number kept oscillating, jerking between the two floors as though the elevator couldn't decide where it actually was. I pressed the button for the 14th floor again. Nothing changed. My heart was moving more quickly now. I pressed the alarm button. It lit up red under my finger, but I heard no sound, or if there was a sound, it existed only in the elevator shaft somewhere far above me, a distant bell ringing in a place I could never reach. Then, without warning, the elevator lurched upward again. The numbers climbed smoothly, 9, 10, 11, 12, but when I looked at the display, I noticed something else. The numbers weren't simply illuminating in sequence, they were bleeding slightly, the red digits smearing at the edges as though they were wet. I rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, they were normal, crisp and digital and perfectly dry. The elevator reached the 14th floor. The doors opened. The hallway beyond was correct in every detail. The carpet was the same shade of gray I remembered, faintly patterned with geometric shapes that disappeared if you looked at them directly. The walls were white, broken up at intervals by framed prints of abstract art that had always seemed chosen specifically to be forgettable. The fluorescent panels in the ceiling cast their familiar hum and sickly pale light. I could even see the supply closet on the left with its smudged nameplate, and beyond that, the conference room with its glass walls. Everything was exactly as it should be, except that the hallway was longer than I remembered, not dramatically so, not in a way that would have been immediately obvious to someone visiting for the first time. But I had walked this hallway 5 days a week for the past 3 years. I knew its length the way you know the length of your own arm, not through measurement, but through use and familiarity. This hallway extended perhaps 15 feet further than it should have before it reached the area where the individual office doors began. I stood in the elevator vestibule for a moment, looking down the extended corridor. My office was at the far end, past the cluster of desks that belonged to the junior marketing staff, down a narrower hallway that jutted off to the right. I could just barely see the corner where that hallway began. I started walking. The carpet was softer than I remembered. Each step felt slightly muffled, as though I were walking on a layer of dust so fine it was almost invisible. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears. I passed the supply closet, past the conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see the long table inside, the chairs arranged neatly around it, and on the far end of the table, a coffee mug that I didn't remember leaving there. It was white, with a simple black handle, and it contained liquid that was still steaming slightly. That was impossible. The office was closed. No one was here. I kept walking. The junior staff area was deserted. The desks were arranged in a rough U shape, and they were all exactly as I'd last seen them, or as I thought I'd last seen them. I was losing track of time, of what had happened and when. The computer screens were dark. The desk chairs were pushed in neatly. On one desk I thought it belonged to Morgan, but I wasn't certain. There was a framed photograph lying face down. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. I didn't stop to look at it more closely. The hallway that led to my office was narrower, as I'd remembered. The walls seemed to close in slightly on either side. My office door was at the very end, a simple wooden door with a brass nameplate that bore my name and my title. I reached for the handle. It was warm, not just warmly from sitting in the ambient temperature of the office, actively warm, as though someone had been holding it only moments before I arrived. I hesitated, my hand hovering just above the metal. I had to go in eventually. This was why I'd come, wasn't it? Or at least this was where I'd intended to come. I pulled the door open. The office was exactly as I'd left it yesterday, or the day I thought was yesterday. The desk was clear except for a computer monitor and a keyboard. The chair was pushed back slightly from the desk as though someone had just stood up from it. The filing cabinet against the wall was closed, its drawers aligned properly. The window behind the desk looked out onto the city, onto the slanting afternoon light that made everything look slightly golden and slightly false. But there was something wrong with the proportions. The office was smaller than it had been this morning, or it seemed smaller. The walls appeared to be closer together than they should have been, and the ceiling felt lower when I looked up at it, as though the room had compressed slightly, squeezing inward from all sides. I took a step into the office and turned to close the door behind me, and when I did, I noticed something that made the back of my neck go very cold. The hallway I just walked through was no longer visible. The wall behind the closed door was blank, completely blank. No frame around the door, no trim, no indication that a door had ever been there at all. Just white wall, unbroken, extending up to the ceiling. I turned the handle. It opened outward. There was no way it could have opened inward, I realized with a strange clarity, and revealed the hallway beyond. The hallway was exactly as I'd left it, the gray carpet stretching away toward the conference room, the indirect lighting casting its even pale glow. I stepped back into the office and closed the door again. The wall was blank again. I stood very still, trying to think through what I was seeing. There had to be an explanation. There had to be something rational that could account for this. Maybe the door had a special mechanism. Maybe when viewed from inside the office, the frame wasn't visible. Maybe I was simply misremembering what the hallway looked like. Maybe I was tired and my perception was unreliable, and everything I was seeing was being filtered through a mind that was already suspicious of its own senses. I opened the door once more, stepped into the hallway, and turned around to look at the door frame. It was completely normal. A standard office door mounted in a standard frame with my name on a standard nameplate. There was nothing unusual about it at all. But when I closed the door and looked from inside the office, the wall was blank. I sat down slowly in my office chair. The seat was warm. The armrests were warm. It was as though I had only just stood up from it seconds before I opened the door and came in. But I hadn't been in this office. I'd been in the elevator. I'd been walking through the hallway. Where had I been? I couldn't remember leaving this office yesterday, or the day before that. I couldn't remember the last time I'd actually left. Outside the window behind my desk, the light was fading from golden to a deeper orange, edging toward red. The city beyond the glass was becoming harder to see, its outlines becoming vague and indistinct. Soon it would be dark. Soon I would be sitting here in the dark, and I would have to decide whether to turn on the lights or whether to sit here and wait for whatever came next. I put my hands flat on the desk in front of me. There was something written on the surface, not carved or marked, but written in what looked like dust or ash or something fine and gray. 3 words in handwriting that might have been my own or might have been someone else's. You're still here. I wiped the words away with the palm of my hand, and they smudged into a gray streak that looked like old dirt or the residue of something that had been sitting there for longer than I wanted to think about. My hand came away feeling strange, not sticky, but tacky, like the dust had texture and weight that dust shouldn't have. I rubbed my fingers together and felt the particles settle into the creases of my skin, fine and pervasive. The words didn't matter. Words written in dust by someone, by myself probably, in a moment of stress or confusion, were just words. They could be explained. They could be rationalized. Except I knew I hadn't written them. I knew this with a certainty that bypassed all reason and spoke directly to something primitive in my nervous system. I had not written those words. I stood up and turned away from the desk. The office suddenly felt smaller than it had before, not in the measured way that rooms get smaller when you've stared at them too long, but in an active, malevolent way. The walls seemed to have contracted inward. The distance between my desk and the far wall had compressed. I measured it with my eyes and found myself walking the length of the office, counting steps, and arriving at the wall after only 8 paces when I was certain, absolutely certain, that it should have taken at least 12. The light outside had turned red now. Not the fading amber of a normal sunset, but a deep arterial red that seemed to emanate from the clouds themselves rather than being reflected from the sun. I couldn't see the city anymore. The window showed only that red light, and beneath it a kind of murky darkness that might have been buildings or might have been nothing at all. I turned back toward the door. The blank wall was still there, of course. When I opened it, the hallway appeared. When I closed it, it vanished. But I had stopped trying to explain it. Some part of my mind had made a decision to move past the phase of rationalization and into something else. Acceptance, maybe, or a kind of pragmatic horror that recognized the impossible and simply continued. You kept breathing. You kept thinking. You kept moving, because the alternative was to sit in one place and wait for the weight of wrongness to crush you entirely. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The conference room at the end was dark. The lights that had been on before, the even, pale overhead panels that cast their institutional glow over everything, were off now. The hallway stretched in both directions, but the darkness ahead was absolute. I couldn't see where it ended or if it ended at all. It simply dissolved into nothing, as though the hallway had no terminus, no place where the building resolved into actual architectural space. I looked down at the carpet beneath my feet. It was a darker gray now. Or perhaps the red light bleeding through the windows made it seem darker. Either way, it was possible to trace its path. The carpet extended into the darkness ahead, a slightly lighter stripe against the void beyond, like a path marked out for me. When I turned back to check the door I'd just exited, my office was visible through the frame, lit in the same red light that stained the hallway. My desk was still there. The chair still sat in front of it, and the seat was still warm when I placed my hand on it, as though I had been sitting in it continuously, even while I stood here in the hallway. The carpet beneath the desk showed a worn spot directly in front of the chair. A worn spot that hadn't been there, or that I hadn't noticed before. It was the kind of wear that developed over months or years of the same person sitting in the same place. "Hello?" I called into the hallway, toward the conference room, toward the darkness. My voice sounded strange, not muffled or absorbed, but as though it were moving through a space that was much larger than it appeared. It echoed, but faintly, and the echo seemed to come from above, from the ceiling that I couldn't quite see. No one answered. Of course, no one answered. But something had changed in the quality of the silence. It had become active. It was no longer the absence of sound, but a presence in itself, a waiting, attentive quiet that seemed to be listening to me in return. I stepped further into the hallway, away from my office. Behind me, I heard the door close. I didn't turn around, but I knew it had closed because the sound was unmistakable, a soft snick of the latch settling into place. I also knew that when I turned to look, the door would no longer be there. The wall would be blank again. The part of my mind that was still trying to function rationally wanted to turn around and confirm this, to add one more data point to the accumulating evidence of something fundamentally wrong. But I didn't turn around. Turning around meant accepting that I might not be able to walk back that way. Turning around meant acknowledging that there might not be an out anymore, only the hallway, stretching in both directions now with no visible endpoint in either one. The red light was stronger here. It pulsed, I realized, not dramatically or suddenly, but in a slow, rhythmic way that might have been my own heartbeat reflected back to me through the windows. The light would brighten, then dim, then brighten again. With each brightening, the hallway seemed to extend further. With each dimming, the darkness ahead seemed to advance a little closer. I heard a sound from somewhere deeper in the building. Not footsteps, but something that suggested movement, a soft shifting, a displacement of air. The kind of sound that something makes when it's moving through a space that it knows intimately, that it inhabits as though it belongs there. The kind of sound a person makes when they're walking through their own home without thinking about where their feet are going. The sound came again, closer now. I stopped walking. The hallway extended ahead of me into that absolute darkness, and somewhere in that darkness something was moving. Something that had perhaps always been moving through this building. Something that might have been walking these hallways when I was sitting at my desk. Something that might have been the reason the seat was warm when I sat in it. Something that might have been doing whatever it was doing in this office for so long that the carpet had worn through. The red light pulsed, and in that moment of brightening I saw what I had been too afraid to see before. The windows that lined the hallway weren't showing the city at all. They were showing an office. My office. From the outside, looking in, and I could see myself sitting in the chair at my desk, even though I was standing in the hallway. I could see myself quite clearly in that red light, and the person sitting in that chair was staring directly at me through the glass, across the space between the window and my actual position, with an expression of perfect recognition on their face. They tilted their head slowly, in a way that I would have tilted my own head if I were watching someone else discover what I had just discovered. And then the red light dimmed, and when it brightened again, the figure in the window was gone, and the office beyond was empty, and I was standing alone in a hallway that seemed to stretch forever in both directions. With that soft, deliberate sound of footsteps moving behind the walls. Hashtag Part 4. Aftermath. The next thing I can verify with certainty is that I was outside the building. The transition isn't clear to me. I don't have a memory of the hallway ending, or of walking toward an exit, or of pushing through a door. There's a gap. But I was standing on the street corner at what must have been around 6 in the morning. And the city was starting to brighten with the color that comes just before dawn. Not red, a pale, almost colorless gray that slowly warmed to something closer to pink. Regular, ordinary, the kind of light that office buildings were designed to ignore. I looked up at the building. It was exactly as I remembered it from the outside. 12 stories, glass, and concrete. Nothing unusual about the architecture or the way it sat among the other buildings on the block. The windows on the 7th floor were dark. There was no red light visible from the street. The whole structure looked inert, used, the way any commercial building looks at that hour. Just another place where people worked during the day and abandoned at night. I walked home, and I remember being surprised by how normal the walk felt. The streets weren't empty. Exactly. There were other people out. Someone walking a dog, a delivery truck making early rounds, a woman standing at a bus stop with a coffee in her hand. None of them looked at me. I was wearing the same clothes I had been wearing the day before. My hair was probably uncombed. But no one seemed to find anything wrong with me, so I must not have looked as destroyed as I felt. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. The coffee cup was still on the counter, the bed was still unmade, the shower still needed cleaning. All the small failures of my domestic life were still there, waiting for me, and they felt like evidence of continuity. If these things hadn't changed, then the world hadn't changed. The world was still the world I understood. I slept for what might have been 12 hours. I remember waking up once in the middle of the afternoon and then sleeping again. When I finally woke up for real, it was evening, and I lay in bed for a long time without moving, taking inventory of myself. I wasn't injured. I didn't feel drugged. My mind was working clearly, perhaps more clearly than usual, actually. Every detail of what had happened was vivid and accessible. No gaps except for that one, the passage from the hallway to the street. I called in sick the next day. Not to that office. I didn't go back there. I found work elsewhere instead, a different building, a different company, a different set of hallways to navigate. It took 3 weeks, but I managed it. The new job was slightly worse pay and less convenient to the apartment, but those felt like small concessions for the certainty that I would never have to enter that other building again. For several months, nothing unusual happened. I settled into the new position. The work was unremarkable. Spreadsheets and email chains and the occasional meeting that could have been an email. The hallways in this building were shorter and better lit. The windows showed the street and the other buildings in the city as it actually was. The office was warm during the day and cold at night, which is what offices do. I could have forgotten the whole thing. I could have filed it away as a waking dream, stress-induced. The kind of mental glitch that happens when people work too long without proper sleep, except for the dreams. They didn't come every night. And they weren't nightmares exactly. They were just walks. In them, I was walking through hallways that I recognized but couldn't quite place. Hallways that might have been in the old office building, or might have been in this new building, or might have been in some composite version that existed only in the architecture of sleep. The light in these dreams was often ordinary, fluorescent, overhead, professional, but sometimes it was that same red, pulsing with the same rhythm, and in those dreams I would start walking faster, trying to wake myself up, until I remembered that trying to wake up was #additional middle section. The fluorescent panels above my desk hummed with that particular frequency that only becomes noticeable after hours, a sound I'd never quite registered before, though I'd been sitting under them for 3 years. Now it was all I could hear, not a constant hum, I realized, but rhythmic, almost like breathing. In, out, in, out. I looked up at the fixtures, no variation in their light. Steady, white, clinical, but the sound continued its gentle pulse. My desk was exactly as I remembered leaving it, except I couldn't quite remember leaving it. The coffee mug sat 3 inches from my keyboard, half full, a thin film of brown liquid across its surface. I touched the ceramic. Room temperature. Not cold, not warm. Suspended somewhere in between, like it had been waiting at this exact temperature for a precise amount of time. The office around me felt larger at this hour than it did during the day. The cubicles stretched toward the windows in what I knew was a straight line, but the perspective seemed off, the fabric dividers appearing to angle slightly inward as they receded, converging toward something I couldn't quite see. The safety exit sign at the far end glowed that particular shade of red-green that always made my eyes water. I hadn't noticed before how the light from it barely touched the floor, creating a kind of darkness that seemed deeper than it should be. I stood and walked toward the break room, my shoes making no sound on the carpet. I'd worn hard-soled shoes yesterday, I was certain of that. Or was I? Now I was wearing something with a soft tread. The carpet fibers, when I looked down at them, seemed to have arranged themselves into patterns I hadn't seen before. Geometric, almost deliberate. The break room was exactly where it should be, but the angle at which I approached it felt wrong. The hallway leading to it was perhaps 15 feet long. I counted my steps. 17. I turned back toward my desk, counting again. 19. Different routes, different distances. My throat tightened. The refrigerator in the break room hummed differently than my desk, a lower, sadder sound. Inside, nothing had changed since Friday. The same margarine container with someone's name written in fading marker. The same bottles of condiments arranged on the shelf with their labels facing forward, like they'd been positioned by someone meticulous. Someone I'd never thought about before. The light from inside the refrigerator illuminated my hands in a way that made them look like they belonged to someone else. Too pale. The veins too visible, the knuckles too prominent. I closed the refrigerator and looked at the microwave beside it. The digital clock read 3:17. That meant something. It had to mean something. I'd looked at this clock before countless times, heating up lunch, waiting those 3 minutes, but this time the numbers seemed heavier, more significant. 3:17, the kind of time that sticks with you for reasons you can't articulate. Back at my desk, I sat in my chair and rolled it slightly, the casters moving across the carpet with that familiar soft friction. But the distance traveled seemed longer than the effort I'd applied. My chair rolled nearly 3 feet when I expected 2. The momentum continued slightly longer than physics should have allowed. I gripped the edge of my desk. The laminate was cold under my palms, surprisingly cold. The texture was familiar. I'd felt it 1,000 times, but now every ridge and imperfection seemed significant, encoded with information I couldn't decode. The windows behind the cubicles showed only darkness, complete, undifferentiated darkness. No lights from other buildings, no stars. No reflection of the office itself against the glass, just black. I'd never noticed before how the office seemed to exist in a kind of isolation, suspended in that darkness, untouched by it. The glass barrier between here and outside felt less like a separation and more like a membrane, something permeable, something that suggested the darkness could seep through if given time. The other desks sat empty, their monitors dark, their chairs pushed in at precise angles. Someone had cleaned this office. Recently, the trash cans were empty, the whiteboards erased, everything arranged with the kind of care that suggested either obsession or routine so ingrained it had become invisible. I had no memory of anyone cleaning anything. But the evidence was everywhere. The faint smell of disinfectant lingering beneath the staleness of recycled air, the pristine surfaces, the absence of the usual detritus that accumulated in shared spaces. My breathing had become audible to me. I could unhear it now. Each exhale seemed to disturb the air in ways I could almost see. A displacement, a ripple in the stillness. The temperature of my breath made the already cold air feel colder. Or perhaps the air was warming to meet my breath, creating a neutral zone where neither was distinctly real anymore. I looked at my hands again. The same hands that had typed emails, held pens, gripped coffee cups. But sitting here in this fluorescent isolation, they seemed like approximations of hands, close enough to pass inspection, close enough that I wouldn't question them in the daylight. But here, now, in this suspended time and this enlarged space, they were almost abstract, its own kind of trap. The dreams always ended the same way, with the sense that something else was in the hallway with me, not chasing, just walking in the same direction I was walking, keeping pace, never getting closer, but never falling behind. When I woke from these dreams, my heart would be racing, but I wouldn't be able to remember exactly what I had dreamed. Just the feeling of that presence, just the knowledge that I had been walking beside something that belonged in those hallways more than I did. The worst part was that some mornings, I couldn't remember which building I worked in until I left my apartment and walked to the street corner to see where I was supposed to go. The two buildings started to blur together in my mind. The 7th floor of the first office and the 6th floor of the new office seemed, in retrospect, to have been the same space. The desks looked the same. The carpet was the same color. And sometimes, sitting at my desk in the new building, I would feel absolutely certain that I was sitting in the old building, that I had never left, that perhaps the walk home and the apartment and the new job were the dream, and the only real thing was this desk and this chair and this window showing a red-lit street below. I started keeping a journal, very specific notes. The date, the time, the name of the building, the exact layout of my desk. Evidence, anchors, a way to keep the present from sliding backward into that hallway. I don't know if it helped. The journal exists, and the entries are consistent. I'm clearly the person who wrote them, clearly the person trying to hold on to some coherent understanding of which building I was in and what day it was. But the act of writing them felt less like creating clarity and more like performing clarity, like I was following the prescribed steps of a person who knew what reality was supposed to be like. The thing I haven't told anyone, the thing I'm not sure I can quite explain, is that sometimes I feel the warm seat before I sit down. I'll walk up to a chair in the break room or at a meeting table, and I'll know that someone was just sitting there. Someone was sitting there right before I walked in. And I'll stand there for just a moment too long trying to decide whether to sit in that warm spot or to find a different chair. And every single time, I sit down. Because at this point, I don't think it matters which building I'm in, or whether I ever actually left the office that first day, or whether the person who left my apartment this morning was really me in any meaningful sense. There's something that walks these hallways. There's something that sits at these desks. There's something that understands this architecture in a way I never will. And it knows where to find me. It knows my schedule better than I do. It knows which seats will be warm by the time I arrive. Maybe it always did. Maybe it's been leaving warm seats for me to sit in since the very beginning.